Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Zoe Shuttleworth, and welcome to my EA Zoom meeting. Thank you, Linda, for the amazing space that you've created here and the opportunity. I'm very excited to be here. First of all, I just wanted to clear up any lack of clarity around the title of my talk today, which is At Water's Edge, Becoming Through Parenthood. It might be self-explanatory, but it really refers to the edge, sort of the shoreline between consciousness and unconsciousness, which is the emotional realm of Cancer. And how this really comes alive, or has come alive for me, is through parenthood. But having said that, I don't want to exclude anybody today. It's not as if the talk is aimed solely at parents, and it's not supposed to be exclusive, or yes, I hope that it will have some broad application and that everyone can potentially get something out of it. So like I said, my name is Zoe Shuttleworth. I'm in Bunbury in Western Australia. I have a website there. There's a link, which is a little unkempt at the moment, but still up and running. I've been a student of astrology since I was a teenager in the early mid-90s. And I'm essentially self-taught, I guess, but I have learned from some incredible astrological minds, including many that come to the EA Zoom audience. So I feel pretty honoured to be among them. Yeah, so I'll be blending today the evolutionary astrological paradigm of Jeffrey Wolf Green and sort of archetypal astrological perspectives with a Jungian kind of approach as well. So weaving with sort of mythological, archetypal, transpersonal, psychological threads. Hopefully bringing together some new ideas, perhaps. And while I'm on that, this work that I've been bringing together is a result of I'll just go back for a sec, is a result of my personal life. So my work as an astrologer, which is largely with families, particularly mothers, and their children's charts, as well as my personal life as a mother of 3 young children, which has been transformational. And perhaps I should also mention that I've got a 20-degree Cancer sun, so I've been through quite an intense last few years, and it feels, particularly in the last eclipse season, it really came clear to me that what I've been learning and working on may have a collective application. It may be, I feel like I've really tapped into something a lot bigger than myself. So that all of that comes together today. But the next few slides are just sort of to orient us to where I hope to go from the evolutionary astrological point. And so probably everyone knows a lot of the next few slides, but I'll just go over it quite relatively quickly. And it's just an introduction as well to some of the concepts that I'll hopefully flesh out over the next hour. Oops, wrong way. Okay, so the lunar nodes in Cancer Capricorn remain there until May of this year. It's such a powerful few months. It's let me just breathe for a moment. So the Cancer Capricorn axis is often termed as the parental axis as well, and so that's where I'm coming from today. We have all played at least one, if not both, of the roles as parent and or child in our lives. So I hope that means that this content can apply very broadly. But for the purposes of my talk today, I will be talking about a lot about the mother as an expression of the Cancer archetype, but I don't want it to be thought of in a genderized kind of way. The mother lives in us all, and yeah, so I hope that we can all get something from that. First of all, I'm going to talk about some general themes and the sort of personal things we've all been going through with the Cancer Capricorn lunar node transition of the last, 12, 15 months. Yeah. So the lunar south node in Capricorn, for me, it has felt to be a lot to do with, and of course this coincides with the Saturn, Pluto, and now Jupiter in Capricorn, Pallas Athena, etc. It calls us to develop our own integrity, to own our own shadow, our own responsibility to become ourselves, what Jung calls the individuation process, and to bear the suffering that is inherent. Oh, I think my slide might be a little covered there, but it's inherent in life, and particularly pertinent to today, inherent in being a parent. It's a hard road, life and parenthood. The accountability to own our mistakes, maturity to be more than merely sweetness and light, which is a big part of what I want to talk about today, and authority, to be the author of our own lives, to actually not defer to outer external sources of authority and what we need to do, which is familiar to everyone who's studied evolutionary astrology, of course. So we're each responsible for our own personal evolution. There is no amount of structural change from governments or corporations or anywhere else that will replace the need for us to do our own work, which brings us to the Cancer North Node, Lunar North Node, which is all about feeling our feelings and experiencing our emotions, participating in life as we know it, the path beneath our feet. I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Reflecting upon the subjective experience of life as we know it, the inner work and the process of all of that, the shadow work, withdrawal of projections, the awareness of what is emerging within us and acceptance of that, as well as having compassion for ourselves as we go through our own process, and compassion for others as well, knowing that each of us are on our own journeys and it's really challenging. And as well, just to briefly mention the reparenting of the inner child, which I've heard the term reparenting never before until the last fortnight when I've been really working on this talk. And it's like a movement, it seems, and it's so tied in, I guess, to the North Node in Cancer, which is a lovely thing. It's very important kind of inner work, and the movement towards that of each person being able to parent ourselves and take responsibility for our own needs and meeting those needs is powerful. And just to briefly mention the planetary nodes, so which we probably all know about, that Pluto is currently conjoining its own south node in Capricorn and opposing its north node in Cancer, which is obviously a very long-term thing. And in a wonderful talk about the planetary nodes, Rose Marcus a few months ago described Pluto's north node in Cancer as the intended evolution of subjective consciousness, which has a lot to do with where I'm going today. The transits of Saturn and Jupiter through Capricorn, also with their respective south nodes and opposing their north nodes. So all of this really denotes the collective importance of evolution through this axis, and it's ongoing, as we know. It's a long haul, but the next few months are really strong because of the lunar nodes being in Cancer Capricorn, and that won't happen again until 2037, I believe, by which point Uranus will be over halfway through Cancer. So it's it's a good time to really hone in on this, I think. Okay, so to come round to Cancer, along the shores that bridge consciousness and unconsciousness is where Cancer, the crab, finds home. And this is where our growth occurs. In our subjective reality, in the inner experience that we have, paying attention to this, honouring this, and working with this is really where it's at, I think, and that's where I'm going. This painting's by Georgia O'Keeffe. It's beautiful. It's a little bit cut down actually for the slide, but it's, yeah. Okay, so life as we know it is not obstructing the path, it is the path. This is something that I've kind of learned the hard way, I guess. The reality of our lives can be very monotonous, mundane, repetitive, kind of, it can feel quite constricting and limiting and challenging. It's but somehow what happens when we get into that flow state, I guess, of being in the now and in the moment, and sort of surrendering to what is, that is our reality of our real lives, not simply just always planning for peak experiences and jet setting and sort of partying and all of those temptations that exist. Not that we shouldn't have those, but of course we should, but it's a lot of life. And in fact, for me, as I've been so limited, you know, in the past decade, I have found so much meaning in this path beneath my feet, which generally has led largely between the laundry and the kitchen sink. And it's very, sometimes that is hard. Sometimes that entails suffering, and sometimes when I am conscious enough, I realise that that's all there is. It makes no difference really where I am. Actually, I shouldn't say that. It does make a difference where I am, because where I am is exactly where I'm supposed to be. So that's really what I mean when I say that life as we know it is not obstructing the path, it is the path. Because we can so easily get caught up in this idea that we need to be somewhere else and then it'll get good. And that's not necessarily the case. And that leads to a very challenging way of living, I feel. I think Michael Meade calls it the wrong kind of trouble, which I really liked. You know, the idea that we can, it's sort of like distraction and escapism and that sort of thing, which has really come up a lot with Neptune through Pisces, of course, and the distraction in the palm of our hands all the time. We can just escape to a screen, and not that that's necessarily that pleasant, but yeah. Anyway, so yeah, another way to look at that idea is as fate and destiny, or our lot in life, which is an idea that has come up again as I've been treading this quite repetitive kind of path, that it is my lot in life, and that somehow this sort of existence where I find myself, I imagining further afield where I could be or what I could be doing, but actually my lot in life is to be right here with my children. And of course I wouldn't really want to be anywhere else when it comes down to it, but there's the, you know, the monkey mind or whatever that sort of tricks us into thinking that something better, you know, is around the corner. But this idea of fate, or the Greek Moira, so this image is by a man called John Melhuish Strudwick, I've probably pronounced that terribly, is of Clotho, Lachesis and Atropos, which also probably pronounced not too well, but Clotho being the weaver of the thread, Lachesis being the one to measure, and Atropos to be the one who cuts the thread. these ideas perhaps are kind of out of fashion maybe in our culture, like where we're sort of very oriented towards co-creation and consciousness and making a life the way that we envision it, and affirming ourselves into being our bigger selves and higher selves and all of that. I don't say that there's anything wrong with those things, but I think it's worth talking about and considering our limitations, and especially, you know, given the recent, or, you know, it's still happening, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn. It has a lot to do with limitations, and it can be very frustrating, and, you know, it'll probably feel quite frustrating throughout 2020 because, sorry about my Australian accent there, 2020, it's the, you know, Mars going through Capricorn, and then the square to from Aries and the retrograde, and all of that is still before us. So we may feel a fair bit of stagnation and frustration over that time. But somehow within that, there is a thread, and that thread is in our everyday lives. It's not about flying off to some other place necessarily. It's not about being on retreat necessarily. It's not about escaping from the discomfort and the frustration and the monotony of our daily lives. It's really right here when we're conscious to what's going on in our lives and in our dreams and in our outer lives, and the things that emerge, you know, they're sort of washing up on those shores of consciousness. The ocean of unconsciousness sort of eroding and exposing things that had been lost and hidden, eroding things to create new forms. All of that occurs through this consciousness to what's going on the inside. As well, the Neoplatonic Jungian idea of teleology, and that life is actually leading us somewhere, and there's a purpose to all of this. And James Hillman talks about it life being better understood backwards. So when the life is complete and we can review it, it sort of becomes clear how it really was going somewhere, and how there was a thread running throughout it that we could hold on to. There's a beautiful poem by William Stafford about that we ought not let go of that thread. Liz Green, in a book that arrived on the day of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in my letterbox, The Astrology of Fate. It was a bit amazing to me. I've wanted to read that book for such a long time, and finally it arrived, and it just speaks about so many of these ideas that I've been working within my own mind. And so the full quote, I've got part of it there. I'll read the full quote. She's writing about Jung equating fate with instinct. The flight of the wild gander is its fate, as is the bursting of the seed into seedling, sapling, leaf, flower, fruit. So too is the instinct to individuate, for a man or a woman to become him or herself. Fate, nature, and purpose here are one and the same. My fate is what I am, and what I am is also why I am, and what happens to me. That's, I think, a very succinct quote of what I'm sort of bringing together today. But it's also a bit of a slippery slope, and it can start to bring people's defences up, understandably, because sometimes it's like we are lumped with something that we feel we really don't deserve, and we're going through really hard times. And as astrologers, we know people come to us when they're in that place of suffering quite often, and they're really looking for answers, and they're wondering what the hell is going on and what have they done and what's gone wrong, basically. And so my thinking is that it's not that we've done anything wrong, and it's not even necessarily like a karmic situation. Of course it might be, but it's really, for me, it feels like it's just sort of leading us somewhere. We are sort of corralled in a direction, and sometimes when we want to go one way, our conscious self wants to go one way, and we are unable to do that. And sometimes it can take a real knock from life to sort of bring us back to where we are. You know, sometimes we get sick, or like a serious diagnosis even, or something dramatic happens and puts us in our place, and that is a real struggle. And sometimes we're born into situations which are very difficult and actually tragic and traumatic and awful, and I don't want to detract from any of that, and I don't really want to shy away from it either, even though it's really difficult to sort of talk about and make sense of it. It's not an easy sort of line to toe, but I'm going to try and do it as we keep going through this today. So where we sort of find ourselves now is in this collective dark night of the soul. It's such an amazing time to be alive, and as we are all students of astrology, we understand it as being something meaningful, and there's something going on, and we can make sense of it using astrological language and charts and all of that, and thank the gods for that. But for the collective, for most of us, it looks bleak in a lot of ways, and that is a real challenge for each of us. You know, the overwhelming news media at times of negativity and the things going on all around the globe, it's sort of impossible to integrate, but it's also very it's heavy, and there's something to that. It's pulling us down, essentially, and I think that there's a reason for that. So it's about, in contrast to the cultural conditioning that we've had to ascend, to expand, to grow, and to make the ascension sort of thinking, I today want to focus more on the descent to the underworld, and the soul, sort of that being an activity of the soul to descend. The emotions that emerge in our personal lives, with frustration and the difficulties of our mundane existence, and the collective conundrum of what we're all facing as a human species. These emotions I've listed here, and by no means are they limited to these, these are pulling us down. And that's not a bad thing. And that's where I think the Cancer archetype is doing her work, is along that edge where we experience these emotions, the anger and rage, all of these that you can read. Eventually, sometimes they can lead to that experience of despairing, and that as well has a purpose. That can bring us to something as well within ourselves, as we surrender to going into that very difficult realm within ourselves. And so this is all sounding pretty bleak, but I promise you there's light at the end of the tunnel, as there always is, the darkness before the dawn and all of that. As we know, the wisdom of Jeffrey Wolf Green, that we evolve through our emotions, and that's exactly what what we're called to do now. It's perhaps never been so pertinent as it is right now with the lunar north node in Cancer and all of the other planetary nodes and the Pluto polarity point and all of that, focusing our energy on this particular archetype. So I call it the evolutionary cutting edge, which is found within each of us. It's that inner realm, the shore, like I was imagining before. And it is accessed via what Donald Winnicott, who coined the phrase and the idea of the good enough mother, we'll talk about that in a minute, the irksome experiences that we have in our lives, the bothersome issues that prevent our peace of mind, all those disruptive emotions that we'd rather not experience, the unsettling stuff, and those annoying things that happen in our personal lives where we are thwarted and where we are disagreed with, and the things that bother us, you know, it's really that inner unsettling that it doesn't feel very good on the inside in our subjective experience. And that's where we need to do the work, especially, I think, when we have resistance to that. And that's a difficult thing. That's a very challenging thing to practice. And I struggle with the resistance of it myself. But as I'm going along, I'm getting a bit better at surrendering to having to do that, just what you perhaps don't feel like you want to do. I've got a Sagittarius moon. I very much like to remain upbeat and buoyant and looking at the meaning and the bright side and all of that sort of thing. So I get how that is a tendency for a lot of us, especially when we're sort of on a road of evolution and we're thinking about being conscious in our lives and all of those things, which is so important. But the other part of this, the flip side of the same coin, is definitely the dark side, you know, the need to honour our inner experience, which is not always love and light. And that is very, very important at this time. And I think that that's part of the purpose of all the collective events. We cannot fail to feel those emotions, all the rage and the, you know, looking at what's happening. It's impossible to not be stirred. And I limit my exposure to it because as a mother, I have to remain somewhat buoyant. It feels like perhaps, what have I done bringing children into this world sometimes? But we have to obviously keep going, and it's like it's not certainly is not all bad news, and we get that experience through getting into that experience, getting into the difficulty and the downward pull of those so-called negative emotions. Which, just as a side note, I really liked a few weeks in December, it was one of the panel talks with Erin Sullivan, and she talked about being negative about the negative, and I really liked that. You know, we are negative about the negative, and it's not exactly healthy. We need to be a little bit more reverent of what that's trying to bring to us, and what the unconscious is actually bringing to us and washing up on our shores. It's actually important. So here we are, the W word, wounded by design, is where I think this ties into parenthood and the autoclavic situation of the family unit and the family home, the high pressures, the heat and the intensity that happens in our homes and in our private lives, and within ourselves, within our psyche. These wounds are what Leonard Cohen referred to beautifully as the cracks where the light gets in. But it's not just like an incidental kind of collateral damage, I don't think. I am more and more, as I'm working with families and children, we are wounded in very specific ways, and it's not necessarily by, you know, narcissistic or ignorant parenting, or it happens sometimes in that way, and sometimes by really people with very major challenges within their own psyches, and terrible things do happen. But still, and this is where it is slippery and difficult to approach it. But it seems to me that these things are very specific, and it's not a punishment, and it's not like a karmic kind of thing where we are repenting or being put through some awful trial in order to cleanse us or something, or teach us some really difficult lesson. Or it's not really like that, but it's more about deepening into these things, that our lot in life, and the experiences, the limitations that we're having, the obstructions that we experience. It's not easy, and it's not pleasant, and it's not easy to talk about either, but there's something happening here. So feeling into the pain, as I've just been talking about, the descent into the underworld, and that being a kind of an initiation. Feeling into the pain of them puts us into contact with our own humanness, which is our vulnerability and our humility and our relatability and our imperfections. And those things make us such better human beings. We're so much better able to relate and connect and have meaningful conversations and a meaningful impact on those that we come into contact with, when we've actually done our work in that sense, when it's not been just a mere kind of transcendence or dismissal of the difficulty, or just rising above it, or all of those things which can so have the spiritual bypass. You know, that's a term that gets thrown around. Yeah, so it's important to go through this process. I'll just have a drink quickly. So I already mentioned that the wounds that are sustained in childhood are not necessarily merely collateral damage, but they are unconsciously but specifically aimed at catalyzing something within our souls. And that is a big part of my work, is that I see, we'll get to the astrological point of view in a couple of minutes. So the wound becomes the womb that brings the seed of our destiny and our gifts to life. And that is such a powerful way of looking at it. It requires that we do our work in order to really feel it and experience it that way. And it's quite difficult to explain, but the idea that blessing, the word blessing, comes from the French word blessure, which means wound. They are definitely linked. There's something that happens to us, to our souls in life. There is a theme, which is the thread which is running through our lives, that we have to continually work with throughout our lives. And that can be traced back to childhood and the childhood wounds that we suffer from our parents and from those, our conditioning, our culture, the time and place into which we're born, all of those things. But it's not necessarily stemming from there, because it may be karmic, it may be past life, it may be inherited, it may be like an ancestral kind of thing. But what happens is that these energies all come together in a family, and in a little cauldron, kind of like a vessel, like this family unit. There's all these energies mixing together. There's all this stuff going on, and there's something trying to come out of all of that stuff that's going on within families. And the child being the wounded one, that apparently, you know, children are so innocent and beautiful and like sitting ducks to parents who are unconscious or whatever and wound them unwittingly most often, and sometimes not. And there are very tragic, traumatic things that occur for children. I don't want to be dismissive of that. But somehow this Chinese proverb, which I heard from, again, Michael Mead in his wonderful podcast called Living Myth, there's a hole waiting for the tusk of the boar. Somehow we are wounded in a way that is specific to our soul, and there is a purpose to that occurrence, that it's not, the wound and the gift are without a doubt linked. I'm seeing more and more. So using astrology as our guide, of course we know as astrologers there's no blank slate, there's no tabula rasa. The birth chart shows, and in multiple layers, we are multifaceted, we are multidimensional, we have all these nuances and contradictions and paradoxes and all this stuff that's going on within our charts. Tendencies, gifts, vulnerabilities, complexes, challenges, natural predisposed ways of being in the world, among many other things. And looking at the charts of family members, like the child and the parent, the synastry between the dynamics of these people who have come together for a purpose, it's absolutely amazing. It's incredibly mind-blowing. The patterns that are visible are not necessarily like, I can't, so far, it's early days for my work in this sort of field, but I've been doing it for a few years, but so far I haven't isolated it to a specific kind of signature, and it's not a specific planet or archetype. It's just that there are themes within every family, and as we explore that, whether it's a dominant sign or a common aspect or a variation on that aspect, with houses and planets and signs, somehow there's something there that we can see. It's a repetitive kind of thing that's coming through, and it highlights what the family is dealing with, whether you look at that karmically or energetically. It's just a profound well of things to work with, though. It's so incredibly powerful, and it's so, what do I want to say here? It's changed my life. It's changing the lives of people I'm working with, to see, to witness this, to observe this, to have the objective perspective that astrology provides, and giving us a way to work with these issues rather than, well, we can ignore them, or we can blame other people for them, or there's lots of ways that we can deal with these things that aren't so healthy. But astrology is such a powerful way of working through this stuff. So as well, I want to say that it's not only wounding that occurs within families, of course, it's also healing. And I have had that exact experience in my own life, and that's not to, give undue power to children or anything like that, but children, of course, bring our awareness to various wounds that we're already carrying and our sensitive spots. And because we come into contact with our own wounded inner child in being parents, and we also, recognizing the innocence of the child and all of those things that come up in parenthood, it puts us in a very fragile kind of spot. We feel vulnerable there, and we're triggered as well. We become triggered by that, and triggered by the fact that we can actually wound the child that we love so much. So that inner work is imperative for parents, because the unexpressed and unconscious material that exists within us, because we don't express it doesn't mean it isn't there, and because we are unaware of it doesn't mean that it isn't there. it affects our children, which is perhaps where that Jung quote, "Nothing exerts a greater influence on the environment and especially on their children than the unlived life of the parent." That's not just parents missing out on social events or whatever. It's more to do with whether we as parents can honour our inner lives and whether we can be true to our soul's nature instead of just simply going into a constant sort of improvement mode. Or I've read dozens of parenting books, especially in the early days of being a mother, and I'm not saying that they're useless, but there is a lot in them that you can become. What has happened to me is that I've become inspired and then I've become quickly deflated because we can't live up to this image of perfection that's sort of held up in the world these days, possibly for mothers especially. It's a lot more complex than that, which I'll talk about again in a moment. So, as well, the William Blake quote, "Our environment does not alter our essential nature, though it may condition it." So that is to say that we're not tabula rasa. We come in with a nature. Our souls are already, they have a substance, they have a nature of their own, and as parents know, that is evident. That is evident, if not immediately at birth. It becomes increasingly evident as time goes on that this little being that is in our care has its own desires and its own its own nature, and it's absolutely beautiful to witness that becoming. And it is also quite frustrating, and it is also quite triggering sometimes, because we come up against this being who we adore. We give everything to this child, and yet there's also that conflict that occurs where two souls, two natures that are not necessarily compatible, come head to head in a house. And it's actually usually more than two souls. That in my house there's 5 plus my dog and my chooks. It's a lot more complicated than just the synastry of one-on-one. It's this vast web of complicated, nuanced, beautiful stuff going on. And within that, we can see things that are happening that are so powerful, and just because we're not conscious of it doesn't mean it's not going on. And so this is another kind of slippery slope. So the inner work that's so imperative for us to do as parents, that doesn't mean we're, ideally, we'd have done all our work before we became parents and we'd be, enlightened or whatever. And that just doesn't happen. That is not the reality of life as a human being. So we inevitably make mistakes. Every single day I make mistakes, and it's so humbling and it's so rich in growth material for me. And it's good to be able to own that with my kids and to be able to recognize my human frailty. And it's also good to be able to apologize and to model that kind of stuff. But it's also so important that I, as the adult, it's my place to carry this stuff. It's not the kids that need to be burdened with the grief that I feel over having wounded them. And this is where it all comes to a point, one of my points, the taboo truth, which I've been touching on. So the fact that we all wound our children. Excuse me while I have a drink. Oh, sorry. So the uncomfortable nature of this, to me, points to its pertinence. And it is uncomfortable to say that we all wound our children. I guess when we look at it from the point of view of the child, as in we all have parents and we all can recognize the wounds that they inflicted on us to varying degrees. You know, the wounds that we have sustained are variable, obviously, and but when we look at what they are, whether they've been perpetuated in ignorance or in a more kind of malicious intended way, which is totally tragic, there is something happening there as well, as in what lies within that wound, within that cavity, that, you know, a wound that can appear. I was a nurse for over 10 years, and sometimes wounds can appear to sort of be healed, and underneath there's like a cavity, and it can fester. And that cavity is like the womb as well, you know, like we can sort of work with that kind of gross image. But yeah, so looking at it from a child's perspective, not as in a child, but being the child of parents and now being fully grown and recognizing our own wounds and having, you know, engaged with the work of that, that's important to think about in relation to this. But it's also important to think about it as parents, as being the wounder, as being the one who wounds, and that is a very painful thing to bring into our conscious awareness and to carry. And so for me, it's been a journey of recognizing how much suffering there is in that, in being the one who wounds, who I have wounded my children, despite knowing better, despite being, you know, I would like to think I'm quite conscious and doing my work and all of those things, and yet I have still wounded my children, and that is a difficult thing to carry. But I have to, you know, that's my work, that's my job, that's my Capricorn. I've got to do that. And it's not like a place of wallowing kind of, but it's a place that has brought me to maturity. I carry that guilt, and I own it, and I, you know, going forward as my children are growing and they're becoming beautiful, bigger beings all the time, and they're incredible, and they'll grow into adulthood, and I'll get to witness all of that, and when they get grown up and they can pay for their own therapy, they, you know, hopefully I'll be able to remember all of this. And that's part of I'm writing a book about all of this stuff because I feel like it is so important to be working with this rich emotional stuff that's very rarely talked about. We have many defenses around this, which I skipped over that point there, and I don't want to skip over it because that is part of, we need to penetrate those crabby defenses. I've got them, and I know they come up for me because I give everything to being a mother. I've given up a career. I've been at home for nearly 10 years. I've given up money. I've given up my time. I've given up, and of course I've gained these three beautiful beings in my life, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. But there are sacrifices to be made, and so there's a massive amount of my energy that's gone into mothering these beings, and yet I still have hurt them. And yeah, it's difficult. It's a difficult thing to circumnavigate, to talk about, to give voice to in a way that is clear. So I hope I am being somewhat clear. But yeah, doing the work of that, and recognizing how much suffering is inherent in being aware of being the wounder. That's important. And there's a lot of victim kind of thinking in think, you know, the wounds that we have sustained. And I just want to mention that briefly, that we can easily get stuck in that world of sort of wallowing in, gosh, I'm nearly out of time. I've just looked at the time there. I will be finished pretty soon. So getting stuck in that victim thinking of we have been wounded by those who should have loved us better. That's one perspective, and that our needs weren't met in childhood in the way that we wanted them to be met, or our soul needed them to be met. And the wonderful work of Jason Holly, who talks about the Cancer as an archetype and our moons needing to be loved in particular ways, and that doesn't necessarily happen, and yet that doesn't necessarily mean that what we've received wasn't love. It's so much more complex than that. It's so much more difficult to sort of pin down. But yes, I'll keep going. So the Jung quote again: without guilt, unfortunately, there can be no psychic maturation and no widening of the spiritual horizon. I think that's talking to the need for us to, as adults, be able to bear the burden of this. First of all, our own woundedness, and second of all, our own capacity to wound people that we love. Okay, so this, to return to the family as fate, the idea, I'll just read this quote, which is from Michael Mead. The old idea is we pick our parents, we pick our bodies, we pick our core images and struggles. Those are some of the elements of our fate. And the whole psychology of victimization is an attempt to deny the presence of fate. And when we deny, what happens is we wake up and there it is again. Fate will return to us with all the nuances of family and the circumstances of our childhood. Family is fate. Those things we've struggled with all along, we will struggle with all along. That's our core stuff. It's hard to know what to add to that in a way. To me, it feels so exactly right. The complexity of the family unit and all the variables within it, and the needs of the whole are not necessarily compatible with the needs of the one, you know, like the needs of one child sometimes go wanting because of the whole picture. And that is a challenging dynamic, you know. It's sort of like the Leo Aquarius thing in a way. I relate to it a lot in that way. The me and we and that whole dynamic, it's very challenging. But viewing it from a point of view of victimization is very disempowering, and it's also, I don't think it's true to just think that we have been the unfortunate victim of something terrible that's happened to us. Although I'm not to take away from the process that's necessary of going through all that. We do need to process our wounds. We do need to process what's happened to us, and sometimes that's a really big deal. And sometimes and as well, just to point out that it's not like a one-time only thing, you know, like we go around with our spiral, kind of the spiral dance of life. It's not that we can idealistically sort of heal something and release it. It's more that we go around and around and around, and we come back upon it from a different perspective. And sometimes it's not so bad as it felt before, and other times it's worse. And it's very complicated. It's very human. It's very irrational and not easy. But that is where this Cancer and the subjective world, and paying attention to all of that, that's where the work is, and recognizing that the things that occur just in our mundane lives and the difficulties that we come across and the people that are in our lives, being the families and our friends and our boss and our co-workers and all of that. It's like this intricate web of what's going on in the world, and it makes up our world. And it's not that we want to escape that or transcend that. We need to really ground ourselves in that and see what's trying to come through and see what it's trying to. It's not like a punitive kind of teaching us a lesson thing. It's what is it trying to bring to our awareness and getting to awareness about it. And that's not to say either that that's easy or that there's going to be some egoic kind of payoff in it for us now or ever. It's not like that. It's very much the soul journey that it doesn't always align with our conscious will. And that interface between the fate of it all, fate, or however you want to imagine it or term it, the interface with fate and free will is very difficult, and it can be quite frustrating. Again, we meet those obstructions, we come up against things, and in reflection, I'm sure that we can all, even like from a Mercury retrograde point of view, for example, think about times when things have been delayed and somehow those delays favor us, or having to retrace our steps, or having to go a different way that actually led us to a better place. So just being able to trust in that idea is a good thing, I think. So yeah, just to briefly again touch on that kind of victim mentality. I have got this I'll just read this abridged version of this quote. So no matter how much parents and grandparents may have sinned against the child, the man who is really adult or woman will, what is the, I can't see my quote properly, will accept these sins as his own condition, which has to be reckoned with. The wise man learns only from his own guilt. He will ask himself, who am I that all this should happen to me? To find the answer to this fateful question, he will look into his own heart. So that, to me, brings up a few things. One, I really like the idea of our condition, our human condition, as a collective and personally. I think it's really a useful way of working with our charts and with our lives. And we do sort of have to reckon with it. It is that kind of a thing. And when Jung here talks about learning from our own guilt, it's not to say again that we've somehow deserved our lot in life, or the difficult or awful things that have occurred. It's not like that. It's not like a judgment-based system. It's not like the cosmos is punitive. It's really bringing us to something. And so the question, who am I that all this should happen to me? It's not coming from the point of view of, woe is me, why has this happened? It's coming from that opening of heart space kind of perspective, where we actually tap into that humanness and we actually find ways to relate to other human beings through this human frailty of our own, I think. So coming back to Cancer as the mother, to me, in my observations and my life as a mother, and being a part of this community and other spiritually oriented communities, I'll just have another drink, excuse me. Mother has been idealized and sentimentalized as tender, gentle, self-sacrificing, ever attuned, an inexhaustible source of unconditional love. She is the perpetual lap. That is one aspect of motherhood, and a place from which it is obviously healthy to be grounded, especially when dealing with young children. We do want to be tender and gentle, some of the time at least, and for our children to come to rely on that is obviously a beautiful thing, that they know that we provide that to them. I always seek to do that as a mother. My conscious self, I seek to be that. So on another dimension, we talk about mother being demonized and scapegoated. So the constant and ongoing, I have to say, the mother bashing that goes on, and medically endorsed mother bashing that goes on, the constant kind of failings of the mother wound, the negative mother, the terrible mother, the death mother, which came from the wonderful Marion Woodman. And I've done a lot of reading and research into that, and there's some amazing talks and things about the death mother, and the work of Daniela Seif, who's a psychotherapist who worked with Marion Woodman. All of that, that's actually a very important part of this whole idea that I'm trying to bring together today. Many of us have come in contact with what they term the death mother, and being like a quite extreme negative mother complex within our own psyches. We've been tainted by that, and we have to do our work with that. There's no doubt about it. But we can get identified with being the victim of that, and that is not healthy either. So the mother archetype essentially is complex, multifaceted, both positive and negative. And Jung talks about the mother archetype as being both loving and terrible, the one who wounds and heals. And that is much closer to the truth. That is a much more balanced way of looking at it. And when we're talking about the North Node in Cancer, we need to be real about this. Like, it's not good. I've read a really pertinent quote this morning, a Jung quote, that goodness doesn't get better by there being more of it, to paraphrase. That was terribly paraphrased, but just because we make more goodness or exaggerate the goodness doesn't make it better, doesn't make it more good. It's it becomes like contrived sort of thing. So, and that is not healthy, because we essentially need to be authentic. We need to be coming from somewhere authentic, somewhere genuine within our own soul, something that's true to our own soul. Okay. So she, of course, lives in us all. It's not a gender issue. Mistakes and successes are made on the daily, in the minutiae of life every day, and the things that come up, and it's a constant state of flux. So one minute I'm loving a child, and the next minute I'm screaming at it, and but it's always in this state of motion. It's like an ocean. It's like that. It's constantly ebb and flow, and so we can damage control and all that sort of thing is ongoing, and where it's very alive. And that's also an important part of Cancer as the mother, and the Cancer archetype is how alive she really is. And being able to bring those pieces together in a personally meaningful way is the work of the time, I think. So also the revisioning of mother. Excuse me a moment. Pardon me. Okay, so the revisioning of the mother. This quote comes from a wonderful book called, I've got it here to show. This book, The Black Madonna of Einsiedel. I can't pronounce it, I'm sorry, by Fred Gustafsson. It's such a wonderful book. And he writes, it is not enough just to say that we need a renewed relationship to the feminine in our times. What is needed is a relationship to the dark side of the feminine. That is, to me, where it's at, what we really have to be looking at. And this beautiful image, not a very good image, but of a beautiful being, the Black Madonna, is powerful. And there are many Black Madonnas in the world, but I don't believe there are many, if any, in the US, and certainly not really in Australia. Anyway, to continue, the Dark Mother, reclaiming our own Kali, our Lilith, our Black Madonna, however you want to relate to her, in from the street protests, where she's getting a lot of airtime out there. It's like the angry feminist kind of aspect to the archetype. It's not the whole picture, and we need to recognize that it's not just about bringing that sort of raging banshee stuff into our lives, although sometimes that is totally necessary and legitimate. But I started reading prematurely then, but recognizing that she is vast. She is actually the void from which we all come. She is synonymous with the unconscious, with the compensatory. She is the compensatory piece of the Western psyche. She's the dark, she's the black in the yin yang image. She's, and we need that. We need all of that. Just another quote from Fred Gustafsson: by refusing to accept the inherent evil in ourselves, we commit it and project it. There's no getting rid of it. It's not as if we can just be more conscious and it goes away. It's still there. The unconscious exists within us all. And here this quote, so there is nothing sentimental about the dark feminine. She captures the mysteries of life that cannot be explained but need to be honoured. And so talking about her today, it's very difficult to sort of articulate exactly who and what she is, but I want to try, because I want to honour her and I want to recognise her aspect in the Cancer archetype. So the unconscious, the idea that we can live or parent completely consciously is a fantasy, unfortunately. We see in nature the cycles, the ebb and flow, the peaks and troughs, the day and night, summer and winter, order and disorder. They're necessary and dynamic. And from the ebb and flow, from the dynamism that is that cycle, ongoing, around and around, spiraling, that is the birthplace of consciousness, that is the birthplace of creativity. And that is the point, the compensatory unconscious, which can be a source and is a source of guidance, creativity and healing, and recognizing that when things go so-called wrong or awry in our lives, that doesn't necessarily, when we look at it in retrospect, actually there was some intelligence, some divinity that had our back all along, and that we need to trust in that a little bit more when we can, in our daily lives, and trying to be reverent of the unconscious, and recognizing that to be unconscious is not inherently bad, and to say things unconsciously, and to let our guard down a bit, and to be unfiltered and uncensored and all of those things. There's a lot of life in that, and it's actually beautiful and powerful and rich, and that is all part of that Cancer realm of like being alert to that, being aware of that, being conscious of what's coming up. And just a brief quote there from the book The Order Disorder Complex by Nathan Schwartz-Salant, which has some wonderful ideas in it about this exact thing. Disorder can lead us to what we may have left out, and if we can tolerate the injury to our narcissism, to care about what we don't know. And that's so, recognizing that we don't know everything, recognizing in humility that perhaps there's something more at play here than just our mere ego and what we might want, and thinking that our ego knows best. I've learned all this the hard way. It's quite crushing to think when we have a plan and it doesn't come off, and it's really not easy. Okay, so briefly, I'm just going to mention the lunar nodes square Chiron and the Eris square Pluto because they seem to me to be quite important parts of the end of this lunar nodes in Cancer Capricorn. So the skipped step of the Chiron square the nodes, to me it talks to what I've spoken about largely today, the capacity to bear our burdens, to know that we're wounded, and that quote from a wonderful New Zealand band, Crowded House, wise enough to carry the scars without any blame. That is it. We need to be able to bear our own burdens in our Capricornness and recognise that we are strong and able to blaze a difficult trail like Aries, like Chiron in Aries, and lead not in spite of our wounds. It's not like a thing about overcoming our wounds or healing them. The healing is ongoing, and perhaps it's like the unhealable wound of Chiron. We are perpetually wounded, and but being able to wound from that place, from knowing that we are flawed human beings, and that is not a negative thing. That is actually the source of our power and capacity to love, is that place. And the woundedness that actually allows us to do our healing work as astrologers and working as counselling people and trying to provide guidance and compassion to people who are in difficult times and going through difficult things in their lives. Never to detract from that or to dismiss it as though it were a deserved thing or something like that. And Jung, to quote Jung again, only the wounded physician heals. We need to go through our own difficulties, or there's nothing authentic in it, is there? We need to have been through our own dark nights of the soul. It needs to be an authentic thing, not a mere transcendence. And just to finally mention Eris, because she is such an important part of the dark feminine, and her discovery in 2005, it just seems that she is very much a part of this to me. And she's had a little bit of press because of the square with Pluto, and that's exact. And so I just want to briefly mention that as well. So this little excerpt comes from the Penguin Book of Classical Myths, and the wedding of goddess Thetis and mortal Peleus was celebrated on Mount Pelion. The muses sang and all the gods attended and brought gifts. All that is except Eris, the goddess of strife, who had not been invited because she was so disagreeable. And I just want to say something to that, because the word disagreeable specifically really spoke to me. It's such a it's uncomfortable, isn't it? When somebody disagrees with us, it's very easy to sit in a room full of people and speak our minds when we're supported and when everybody agrees with us. But to be disagreed with is a totally different thing. To speak up when we know nobody agrees, or that there's a risk of that perhaps no one's going to agree, or perhaps no one's going to see our perspective. That takes courage, and that that is the Aries thing again. So Eris being Eris being the goddess of discord and strife. So etymologically, discord means lacking heart. So Eris is unloved. She is rejected and enraged, as we all are when we feel that we are unloved. It is a very difficult thing to bear that burden. So she is enraged when she turns up at that wedding uninvited. Discord is defined as disagreement, unfriendly feeling, ill will, dissension, and strife. Discordant is lacking harmony. Strife is defined as an angry or bitter disagreement over fundamental issues, conflict. So nobody wants that at their wedding. Nobody wants to sit in the US this year at a dinner party full of Democrats if they're a Republican, or Republicans if they're a Democrat. That is a very conflict, like that's rife, isn't it? It's like that's a difficult place to be disagreed with, to be the one who's exiled, to be rejected, to be, and recognizing Eris as the part of us that is that. So not only, I mean, she is a transpersonal planet. She is coming to be a collective kind of influence, but we need to live these energies in our own lives. And doing that, it's not about just, like I said before, in relation to the dark feminine as a whole, it's not that we all need to go around causing strife for everybody and being very disagreeable, although sometimes that's necessary, but more it's about being able to allow for the difficult parts within our own psyche, the parts that are not easily reconciled, the parts that don't fit our persona, that aren't about our conscious mind and our consciousness, our conscious will, and how we want to be perceived and where we want to be going, but actually honouring the parts of ourselves that are very difficult and disagreeable and discordant, and they make us feel uncomfortable because it's very edgy and it's not a conscious love and light kind of way of being in the world. And so there's a lot of work to be done in that within our own psyches, and being able to stay in that discomfort and endure that real conflict that within our own selves, as well as within our relationships. And that is a big thing for families, you know, being able to have the real conflict, not the neurotic kind of thing where we, rather than suffering through the burden of carrying guilt, we make it about something else. Our anxiety overcomes us and we pick on some other smaller issue that our ego sort of feels like it can manage a bit better because it gets to take the upper hand, and all of that sort of dynamic that's so alive in relationships and families. But rather being courageous enough to stay in the discomfort of what is really trying to come through. Yeah. So this is just to sum up really that life and parenthood evoke the full spectrum of emotions. It is not limited to love and light. And mother is actually ambiguous. She has evolved to be that way. There's a wonderful book about that called Mother Nature by Sarah Blaffer-Hardy, who is an anthropologist. And so mothers have actually literally evolved to be ambiguous towards their children for a reason, and that is the full spectrum of emotions that we do experience. That as mothers, that is a taboo topic, and it's one that's difficult to reconcile in ourselves, and that is part of the work of motherhood and parenthood, and of being the child who is not necessarily fully accepted as who we are as children. We are not necessarily received with open arms. We may be conditioned in damaging ways because we haven't been loved as we wanted to be. So there's dark and light, loving and wounding aspects to the mother. Parenthood brings us into contact with our own wounded inner child, as well as our own capacity to wound our own beloved children. And that is a vulnerable place to work, and that is the Cancer archetype. Working with our own shadow and the guilt, shame and loss of innocence that emerge as our awareness grows, that is where it's at. That is, to me, the axis of the Cancer Capricorn Lunar Nodes situation. And finally, the dynamics of struggling with our values, the principles and ideals, and our conscious mind, and the reality of our lives, and the expression of our unconscious, and the expression of the unconscious through our lives, and the events that occur, and the people we come into contact with, and all of that, as well as the inner unconscious stuff that's emerging. That all contains so much creativity. That is an incredibly powerful place to be, and it is a struggle. It is it's like what Jung called the tension of the opposites, and it allows for the birth of a third thing to come out of that. And that tension is difficult to hold. It is like the opposition in astrology, of course. It can also occur, the friction of the square. It's uncomfortable, but it's very alive, and it's wonderful. So finally, I think this is my second last slide. So love is not the work of tender and gentle. Love is the work of wrestlers, said Rumi. And I think that's so true. It's a constant dynamic struggle with our lives and what's trying to come through it. It's not all about just what we consciously want to happen and creative visualization of that and creating a life of abundance and all that stuff. It's very one-ended. We've got to be able to go between the two, and the richness that exists in that place of the unconscious, and allowing ourselves to be eroded by the unconscious, and like for the exposure of different parts of ourselves to occur. That is where we find the scuttling crab, and that is where I feel like it's just so incredibly beautiful. These are the resources that I've used today. There's some wonderful books there. I used a lot of other ones, but anyway, that is all from me today. Thank you very much for your audience.
Thank you so much, Zoe. From all of us at Facebook Live, we all want to thank you. It's been a wonderful meeting. You've received great feedback, and gosh,
thank you.
Loved it, and we're looking forward to having you back again in the future. So
thank you. That'd be wonderful. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Catch you later. See you soon. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks. Great work.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye, Zoe.
Bye-bye, everyone.